The message arrived on a Tuesday morning. It came through every channel at once: radio frequencies, quantum relay bands, deep space signal arrays, and even the old satellite networks that Earth still kept running out of habit. Every screen on every ship in the outer solar system lit up at the same moment. Every monitoring station between Mars and the Kuiper Belt picked it up. By the time the signal reached Earth's surface, it had already been decoded, translated into 41 languages, and flagged as the highest priority communication in the history of the United Earth Defense Force. It was a declaration of war. The message came from the Grand Dominion, a coalition of 47 alien species spread across 3 arms of the Milky Way. They had been watching humanity for a long time, or so they believed. Their declaration was long. It was written in the kind of language that powerful empires use when they want to remind smaller things of exactly how small they are. It listed humanity's crimes, which were mostly just existing and expanding. It outlined the terms of the coming conflict, which were essentially that humanity should stop existing and expanding. And at the very end, it gave a timeline. The war, the declaration stated, would be concluded in 14 Dominion Standard cycles, 11 Earth days. The message was received at Granite Watch at 6:14 in the morning. Granite Watch was a command facility built deep inside a mountain range in the American Southwest. It had no windows. It had its own power grid, its own water supply, and enough food stores to last 3 years. It had been built to function during the worst possible scenarios. And the people who worked inside it had been chosen because they were, professionally speaking, very hard to rattle. General Nathan Briggs was already awake when the alert came through. He was a big man, wide in the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of something durable. He had grown up in rural Kentucky, joined the military at 18, and spent the next 26 years doing things that were not discussed in polite company. He was not the kind of man who startled easily. He read the declaration once, then he read it again. Then he set down his coffee cup very carefully on the table in front of him. Admiral Laura Voss was sitting across from him. She was a lean woman with sharp eyes, and the kind of posture that came from spending decades on ships where space was limited and slumping was not an option. She had been reading the declaration on her own screen at the same time. She finished it a few seconds after Briggs did. They looked at each other across the table. Then Nathan Briggs started laughing. It was not a short laugh or a polite laugh. It was a deep, genuine, helpless laugh, the kind that comes out of a person when something is so far beyond what they expected that their brain simply doesn't know how else to process it. He pressed one hand flat on the table and laughed until his eyes watered. Laura Voss watched him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she started laughing too. Down the hall, Colonel Danny Ruiz heard the sound coming from the briefing room and stuck his head through the door to see what was happening. Danny was 29 years old and had been the youngest officer appointed to the Joint Chiefs in Earth's history. He was sharp, focused, and not generally given to confusion. But the sight of the 2 most senior military commanders on the planet laughing like they had just heard the best joke of their lives, with a galaxy-wide declaration of war on the screen behind them, gave him pause. He walked in, looked at the screen, and read the declaration himself. He got to the part about 11 days. He started laughing harder than both of them. The thing that made it funny, the thing that made it the kind of funny that bypasses professional composure entirely, was the intelligence data attached to the declaration. The Grand Dominion had included it, apparently as a show of consonance. They wanted humanity to know that they had been studied, that they were known, that there were no surprises coming. The data was from Earth's early 21st century. It listed humanity's military assets as they had existed roughly 80 years ago. The fleet numbers were from before the Second Space Age. The weapons technology was from before the consolidation. The political structure described was that of a fractured, pre-unified species, still divided into competing nations, still burning carbon-based fuels for energy, still arguing loudly with itself about things that the consolidation had resolved generations ago. The Dominion scouts had visited the solar system during that period, taken their readings, and apparently never come back for an update. They had built their entire war plan around data that was 8 decades out of date. It was, Nathan Briggs would later say, like someone walking up to a professional fighter, poking them in the chest, and announcing that they intended to win the fight using a strategy designed to defeat that person's grandfather. After the laughter settled, and it took a while, the 3 officers sat down and looked at the declaration with clear eyes. The Grand Dominion had made a catastrophic intelligence error. They believed they were going to war against a divided pre-industrial space-age species with a handful of orbital stations and a few crude warships. They had no idea that humanity had spent the last 60 years watching the Dominion's expansion and preparing, quietly and very methodically, for exactly this moment. They did not know about the consolidated fleet. They did not know about the 17,000 automated defense platforms ringing the solar system. They did not know about the deep space forward bases, or the rapid deployment squadrons, or the weapons development programs that had been running in classified facilities for 4 decades. They did not know what humanity had become. Laura Voss leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at Danny. "Get the full council on the line," she said. "A lot of it." Danny was already moving toward the door. He paused. "What do I tell them the situation is?" Laura glanced at the declaration still glowing on the screen. "Tell them we've received a formal declaration of war from an empire that thinks we're still driving around in gas-powered cars." Nathan Briggs, still smiling, reached for his coffee cup. "Tell them to bring a sense of humor, too." While the council assembled, the declaration continued broadcasting across the solar system. Out on the frontier stations, officers and crew were reading it for the first time. Reactions varied, but there was a common thread, a kind of puzzled amusement, followed by the slow realization of what the attached intelligence data actually meant. On a deep space monitoring post near Jupiter, a young signals officer named Pete Garza read through the Dominion's listed estimates of Earth's fleet strength, looked at the actual fleet manifest on his own screen, and quietly set both documents side by side. He stared at them for a long time. Then he walked to the break room, poured himself a very large coffee, and came back to his station. He had a feeling it was going to be an interesting week. Fleet Lord Soren of the Veth had never lost a battle. He had served the Grand Dominion for 32 years, and in those years he had fought 12 military campaigns across 9 different star systems. He had crushed rebellions, pacified border disputes, and brought 3 separate civilizations to heel without breaking a sweat. He was considered, within the Dominion's military circles, to be one of the finest tactical minds of his generation. He commanded 300 warships. He was not worried. His fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system on a Wednesday afternoon, Earth time. Soren stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and looked out at the dark ahead of him. He knew what to expect. A handful of orbital stations, some basic satellite networks, perhaps a small defensive fleet that would scatter when it saw 300 warships materializing out of nothing. What his long-range sensors showed him instead was something that took his tactical team 4 full minutes to process. There were platforms everywhere. Not a few, not a handful. 17,000 automated defense platforms arranged in overlapping grids, interlocking fields of fire, and layered defensive zones that stretched from the outer system inward, in a pattern so dense and so carefully designed that Soren's chief tactician, a highly experienced officer named Brack of the Keth, looked at the readout and went very quiet for a long time. Behind the platforms, further in system, sat a fleet. It was not a small fleet. Soren's intelligence had estimated Earth's total military capacity at roughly 40 to 60 vessels of varying capability. What his sensors were reading was something north of 300 ships in the immediate defense group alone, with energy signatures beyond them suggesting additional formations further in system. The ships were large. Their power signatures were strong. They were arranged in a formation that spoke of long practice and very serious professional attention. Soren stood on his bridge and looked at this for a while. Then his communication console chimed. The voice that came through was calm, unhurried. It had a mild accent that Soren's translation matrix identified as originating from the North American region of the human homeworld, a place called California. The voice belonged to Captain Greg Calloway, commanding officer of a carrier-class vessel the humans called the Iron Meridian, and what he said was polite enough. He told Soren that the automated platforms had acquired targeting locks on every vessel in the Dominion formation. He noted that this had taken the platforms approximately 40 seconds from the moment of the fleet's arrival. He said that the lock would convert to active fire in 9 minutes unless Soren reversed course. He said this in the same tone of voice a person might use to explain parking regulations. He then asked, pleasantly, whether Soren needed any clarification on those terms. Soren did not respond immediately. He was looking at his sensor readout. His tactical officer, Brack, had finished his analysis and was now standing very still, in the way that experienced officers stand when they have finished doing math and have not liked the answer. Fleet Lord, Brack said quietly, the platform targeting data is accurate. I am reading active lock signatures on all 300 vessels. Soren thought about the intelligence reports. He thought about what Earth was supposed to be. Then he thought about what his sensors were telling him it actually was. Hail the human ship, he said. Tell them this is a bluff. The message was sent. Greg Calloway, on the bridge of the Iron Meridian, received it. He read it. He looked at his tactical display, where 300 Dominion ships were sitting inside the kill zone of 17,000 platforms. And he took a slow breath. He did not respond to the message. He checked the clock. At 8 minutes and 53 seconds after the initial warning, Soren finally gave the order to reverse course. It was 7 seconds too late. The platforms were not set to a hard 9-minute timer. They were set to fire when the tactical AI calculated that the intruding fleet had committed to an aggressive posture beyond a certain threshold. And that threshold had been crossed when Soren ordered his forward squadrons to begin moving inward. The engagement lasted 3 minutes and 41 seconds. In that time, 239 Dominion warships were destroyed or disabled. The platforms did most of the work. The Iron Meridian and her accompanying ships handled the portions of the fleet that managed to push through the outer grid, which was not many. 61 Dominion vessels managed to reverse thrust and accelerate away fast enough to enter FTL and escape. The Iron Meridian sustained 0 casualties. No hull breaches. No significant system damage. One crew member had sprained her wrist during an evasive maneuver and had been treated and returned to duty within the hour. Calloway sat down in his command chair after the last Dominion ship vanished from the sensors, and looked at his display for a moment. Then he pulled up the after-action report template on his screen and began filling it out. The engagement classification field had a drop-down menu with options ranging from routine intercept at the low end to critical engagement at the high end, with several options in between. Calloway selected routine intercept. His executive officer, Lieutenant Sandra Tran, glanced over at his screen from her station. Routine, sir? Calloway thought about it. They flew into a prepared kill zone after being given 9 minutes of warning, he said. If they'd scattered immediately, we might have had a real fight. They didn't scatter, so yes, routine. Fair enough. Calloway finished the report. He recommended 4 members of his crew for standard performance commendations, not exceptional ones. He noted his reasoning in the comments section. The enemy had not presented sufficient tactical challenge to warrant exceptional commendations. He sent the report up the chain and then went to get coffee. When General Nathan Briggs received the after-action report at Granite Watch, he was in the middle of a council meeting. His aides slid a tablet in front of him with the report open on the screen. Briggs read the engagement summary. He read the casualty count, 0. He read the classification field, routine intercept. He read the note about the commendations. He set the tablet face down on the table and pressed his knuckles against his mouth for a moment. Admiral Laura Voss, sitting beside him, noticed his expression and raised an eyebrow. He slid the tablet to her, without comment. Her lips pressed together very firmly for several seconds in the manner of a person who is exercising significant professional restraint. "Routine," she said softly. "Routine," he confirmed. Across the table, Danny Ruiz leaned over to read the screen. He got to the part about the commendations. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere across the galaxy, on a Dominion communication relay, Fleet Lord Soren was filing his own report. His hands were not entirely steady as he typed. He had served for 32 years. He had never lost a battle. He had just lost 239 ships to an automated defense grid, and 1 carrier that had classified the entire engagement as a routine Tuesday afternoon. He sent his report and sat in silence for a long time. The Grand Council, when they received it, decided his numbers were exaggerated. They were already preparing the Second Fleet. On the 9th day after the declaration of war, humanity stopped waiting. It was not announced with great ceremony. There was no broadcast, no dramatic speech, no moment of national rallying. The order went out through secure command channels in clean, plain language. A single paragraph authorizing the forward strike groups to begin operations. Nathan Briggs signed it at his desk at Granite Watch, with a cup of coffee at his elbow, and a stack of pending reports on his left that he planned to get to later. Then he went and packed a bag, because he had decided he was going with them. When Laura Voss found out, she stood in his office doorway for a moment, with her arms folded, and looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has done something technically within regulations, but clearly designed to test the limits of common sense. "You're the general," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't need to be on a forward ship." "I know that too. So why are you going?" Nathan zipped up his bag and slung it over one shoulder. He looked at her with complete seriousness. "Because I have spent 40 years imagining the moment when the Dominion figures out what's actually happening," he said. "And I want to watch it happen in person." Laura thought about this. "Fair," she said. He boarded the mobile headquarters ship, the Long Road, 2 hours later. It was a big vessel, not a combat ship by design, but armored, fast, and equipped with communication arrays and tactical systems that could coordinate a multi-system operation from a single bridge. The crew was professional and quiet. They knew who was on board. They were politely unbothered by it. Colonel Danny Ruiz was already there when Nathan arrived. Danny was commanding a rapid insertion unit. 6 small, fast ships, built for getting in and out of tight situations without being noticed until it was too late. He had a team of 40 people, all of whom had been hand-picked across the previous year for exactly this kind of operation. They were not the biggest or the loudest people in the Earth Defense Force. They were the kind of people who could plan something complicated, execute it quickly, and be 3 systems away by the time anyone started asking questions. The operation they were about to run was not aimed at the Dominion's warships. This had been Laura's idea, and it was the kind of idea that only becomes obvious in hindsight. The Dominion's military was large and well-equipped, and as the 2 fleet engagements had shown, would simply keep throwing ships at the Sol system until someone explained to them in terms they could process that this was not a productive use of resources. Destroying those ships cost Earth almost nothing, but it also did not end the war. It just removed individual pieces from the board, one at a time. What would end the war was removing the board. The Grand Dominion, like any large empire, ran on logistics. 47 species, across 3 galactic arms, did not stay united by military force alone. They stayed united because the Dominion managed the trade routes, controlled the communication relays, distributed resources through a network of supply chains that individual species had become dependent on over generations. Remove the military, and you had a large, angry empire. Remove the logistics, and you had a large, confused empire that was starting to ask difficult questions about who was actually in charge and what they had ever gotten out of this arrangement. Danny's unit hit the first communication relay at 0400 hours on day 10. It was a deep space installation in a system 2 jumps beyond the soul boundary. A critical node in the Dominion's military communication network for the entire sector. Disabling it would not destroy anything. It would simply make a very large portion of the Dominion's command structure unable to talk to each other clearly for a significant period of time. The operation took 11 minutes. There were 40 Dominion personnel on the installation. Danny's team disabled the station's defenses, boarded it, overrode the communication systems, and evacuated all 40 personnel onto a transport before disabling the primary relay array. The Dominion crew was confused, a little frightened, and entirely unharmed. Danny left them with functional life support, a working beacon, and a polite written note informing them that someone would be along to collect them within 48 hours. He signed it with his name and rank. Then his team was back in FTL before the nearest Dominion patrol could respond. They hit 3 more relay stations in the next 12 hours. Then, a fuel processing installation that serviced a sector of Dominion space covering 11 systems. Each operation followed the same pattern: fast, precise, no casualties on either side, personnel evacuated before anything was disabled. Danny's written notes became a running joke among his team. By the 4th installation, his executive officer, a wiry woman named Carol Sims, had started keeping a copy of each one. "They're going to be historical documents someday," she said. "They're going to be embarrassing," Danny told her. "Same thing," she said. On the long road, Nathan Briggs was watching the operation unfold on the tactical display. Each relay and depot that went offline produced a visible change in the Dominion's communication patterns. Gaps, delays, rerouting that created new gaps. It was like watching a very large net develop holes. Slowly at first, then faster, as each new hole put more strain on the remaining threads. He was not the only one watching. Back on Earth, Megan Holt's diplomatic team was working around the clock. The list of Dominion species reaching out had grown to 19. 4 had formally requested neutral status, meaning they were withdrawing their military forces from Dominion command structures and pulling back to their home systems. The Dominion's Grand Council had declared these species traitors. The Grand Council's ability to enforce that declaration was, at this point, diminishing by the hour. 2 more species had quietly asked whether Earth would be open to a mutual defense treaty. Megan's team drafted responses that were warm, specific, and careful. They made no promises that could not be kept. They simply described, in clear terms, what a cooperative relationship with Earth looked like, and then left the choice entirely to whoever was on the other end of the signal. Most of them chose. On day 11, a Dominion garrison commander in a border system called Shenvar sent an unencrypted signal to the nearest Earth ship, a patrol vessel with a crew of 12, commanded by a lieutenant named Owen Carr. The signal said, in translated terms, that the garrison commander had 2,000 troops under his command, that he had read every engagement report from the Sol System encounters, and that he would very much like to discuss the terms of a peaceful withdrawal. Owen Carr was 24 years old, and this was his first deployment. He looked at the signal. He opened a channel back to the garrison commander, and said in his most professional voice that he would pass the request up the chain of command, and that someone senior would be in contact shortly. Then he closed the channel, looked at his communications officer, a young man named Luis, and said quietly, "Did a garrison of 2,000 soldiers just try to surrender to us?" Luis checked the message again. "Yes, sir." Owen thought about this for a moment. He said. Then he sent the relay up to Danny's unit, which was the nearest command element with actual authority to handle the situation. Danny received the relay, read it, and sent it on to Nathan on the long road with a short note attached. The note said, "It is happening." Nathan read it. He looked at the tactical display showing the growing gaps in the Dominion's communication network. He looked at the list of species pulling away from the coalition. He looked at the garrison commander's surrender request. Then he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Sir?" His aide, a young officer named Ron Briley, was watching him from across the bridge. Nathan looked at the display for a little while longer. "Get me a line to Admiral Voss." When Laura picked up, he did not say anything right away. She waited. "You know," he said finally, "when I was 20 years old, I read a history of every major military conflict in the last 500 years. Every single one. You know what the most common strategic failure was?" "Underestimating the enemy," Laura said. "Underestimating the enemy," he agreed. "They never learn." There was a brief silence. "How's the view?" she asked. Nathan looked out at the stars beyond the ship's viewport. "Better than I expected," he said. The Grand Council of the Dominion met in emergency session 3 days after the destruction of Soren's fleet. The chamber was large and formal, designed to project the weight and permanence of Dominion authority. 47 species were represented at the long curved table. The air smelled of something ancient and institutional. Grand Consul Varekthal sat at the head of the table and listened to Fleet Lord Soren give his account with the practiced expression of a leader who had already decided what he thought before the account had begun. Soren's numbers were checked and rechecked. The Council's analysts came back with the same figures each time. 239 ships confirmed destroyed or captured. 0 human casualties confirmed from intercepted communication fragments. The engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes. A senior council member from the VETH argued that Soren had panicked. Another suggested his sensor data had been corrupted by human electronic warfare. A third proposed that perhaps the platforms had not been human in origin, that some third party had been using the Sol system as a staging ground without Earth's knowledge. Soren sat quietly through all of this. He had served for 32 years. He knew what he had seen. Grand Consul Varekthal let the debate run its course, and then raised one hand for silence. He had a long, narrow face, and the kind of eyes that had spent a lifetime watching people and deciding what they were worth. He looked at Soren for a moment, without expression. "You are relieved of command," he said simply. Then he turned to the council. "We will send a second fleet, 900 vessels. I will personally oversee the deployment." 900 ships had never failed to resolve a conflict in the history of the Dominion. On Earth, no one was particularly concerned about the second fleet. This was not bravado. It was math. Admiral Laura Voss had spent the day after the first engagement doing what she always did when a situation developed. She sat down with her planning team and worked the numbers. The second fleet was expected. A larger force was expected. The defensive grid around the Sol system had been designed with exactly this kind of escalation in mind. The platforms were resupplied and reloaded. The first Sol fleet had been reinforced from the reserve squadrons. A junior tactical officer named Kevin Park had been assigned as the primary response coordinator for the outer system. Kevin was 29 years old. He had completed 3 deployments without incident. He was considered solid, dependable, and methodical. He was not, by his own assessment or anyone else's, exceptional. He had been given this assignment because his superiors believed it was good professional development, and because they did not expect it to require anything exceptional. While the military side of the situation was being handled with brisk efficiency, something more interesting was happening on the diplomatic side. Dr. Megan Holt had been Earth's lead xenopolitical strategist for 11 years. She was a quiet woman with the kind of focused calm that came from spending a career thinking about problems that most people did not want to think about. She had an office at Granite Watch that was famously cluttered, stacked with reports, maps, species profiles, communication transcripts, and 3 different half-finished cups of cold coffee at any given time. 2 days after the declaration of war, her encrypted communication terminal had started receiving unusual signals. They were coming from inside the Dominion, not from any official channel. These were private, carefully routed signals from representatives of smaller species within the Dominion coalition. The ones that had not joined by choice, the ones that had been absorbed rather than invited, the ones that had been watching the Dominion's expansion from the inside for decades and had complicated feelings about it. Megan sat in her cluttered office and read through the signals one by one. Then she compiled a list. Then she walked down the hall and knocked on the open door of the briefing room, where Laura Voss and Nathan Briggs were reviewing fleet deployment data. "I need 10 minutes," she said. She got 20. The list was longer than either officer had expected. 11 of the 47 Dominion species had made contact. Of those 11, 4 were requesting neutral status. They wanted out of the war without reprisal. 3 were offering intelligence on Dominion fleet movements and supply lines in exchange for guarantees of post-conflict consideration. 2 had gone further and were requesting Earth's protection directly, which implied a level of confidence in humanity's capabilities that Megan found both flattering and useful. The remaining 2 were simply asking questions. They wanted to know what humanity's post-conflict intentions were, whether Earth planned to conquer or negotiate, what a future outside the Dominion might look like. Laura read through the list twice. "They declared war on us," she said slowly, "and in doing so, they gave every discontented species inside their own coalition a reason to look for a door." "That's more or less what's happening, yes," Megan said. Nathan leaned back in his chair. "What do you need?" "A dedicated diplomatic team, good communicators, patient ones, and someone needs to tell them to sleep, because I think they're going to be working very long hours." "Done," Nathan said. "What else?" "I need a clear statement of Earth's post-conflict intentions. Something I can show these species. Something honest." Laura looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at Megan. "Tell them we want trade partners, not subjects. Tell them we've been a subject before, and we didn't care for it." Megan wrote that down. "That'll translate well," she said. "It's relatable." The second Dominion fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system 4 days after the first. It was, as advertised, 900 ships, the largest offensive force the Dominion had committed to a single engagement in over a century. They had better formation discipline than Soren's fleet. Their commanders were more senior and had been briefed on what had happened to Soren. They were not going to make the same mistakes. Kevin Park was at his station when the proximity alert fired. He looked at the sensor readout for a moment, and then began going through his checklist in the calm, methodical way that his instructors had drilled into him across 3 years of tactical training. The platforms acquired locks in 38 seconds, 2 seconds faster than they had against Soren's fleet, because the targeting software had been updated with lessons learned from the first engagement. Kevin sent the standard warning message. The Dominion fleet did not respond. Their formation began moving inward. Kevin authorized engagement at the 3-minute mark. The second engagement lasted 6 minutes and 12 seconds, longer than the first, because 900 ships produced more debris that needed to be tracked and cleared, and because 2 Dominion vessels made a coordinated push toward the inner system that required Kevin to redirect 3 of his own ships to cut them off. That part was mildly interesting. The rest was not. 704 Dominion vessels were destroyed or disabled. 196 escaped into FTL. Kevin's after-action report noted 1 crew member who had performed particularly well during the debris tracking phase, and recommended her for a commendation. He classified the overall engagement as moderate difficulty, which was 1 step above the routine intercept that Calloway had used for the first engagement. He did not recommend himself for anything. When the report reached Granite Watch, Nathan Briggs read the moderate difficulty classification and looked at Laura Voss. Laura looked at Danny Ruiz. Danny was the one who said it out loud. 900 ships, moderate difficulty. There was a pause. Kevin's good, Nathan said eventually. He really is, Laura agreed. In the Dominion Council chamber, 900 more confirmation signals came back as destroyed or missing. The chamber was very quiet. Grand Consul Varric Thal sat at the head of the table and looked at the numbers for a long time. He did not speak for several minutes. Then he called his chief intelligence officer and asked, in a measured voice, for a complete and honest reassessment of humanity's current military capabilities. The intelligence officer said it would take some time. Varric Thal told him to make it a priority. Outside the chamber, in a small communications room, one of the Dominion's junior diplomatic aides was carefully composing a private signal on an encrypted channel. It was addressed to Earth. He was adding his name to Megan Holt's list. Grand Consul Varric Thal had not slept well in 8 days. His intelligence office had finally delivered its updated assessment of humanity on day 12 of the war. It was a thick document. His chief analyst, a careful and experienced officer who had served the Dominion for 20 years, had stood before him in the private consultation room and presented the findings with the expression of someone delivering news about a terminal illness. Professionally composed, but with a heaviness underneath it that could not be entirely hidden. The document covered everything. The resource wars of the early 22nd century, which had forced humanity's scattered nations to either cooperate or collapse, and which had produced, through decades of brutal necessity, a generation of strategists, engineers, and logistics specialists who understood how to do more with less, better than almost any other civilization on record. The consolidation, which had unified Earth's governments into a single cooperative structure, and in doing so, had redirected resources that had previously gone into internal conflict toward a single sustained focus. The Second Space Age, which had produced a fleet expansion program running on that redirected energy for 50 continuous years. And the observation section. The observation section was the part that Varric Thal kept returning to. His scouts had last visited the Sol system 80 years ago and had reported a species that was technically capable, but politically fractured and strategically unsophisticated. What the new intelligence showed was that for the 60 years after that visit, humanity had watched the Dominion. They had tracked its expansion patterns. They had studied its military doctrine. They had noted its communication structures, its supply chain vulnerabilities, its political fault lines. They had been preparing, not in a panicked or reactive way, methodically, persistently. The way a species prepares when it has looked at something large and powerful approaching from a distance and decided, collectively and with great seriousness, that it is going to be ready when that thing arrives. The automated platforms had been built 30 years ago. The fleet had been expanding for 4 decades. The diplomatic protocols for the Dominion's internal species, the ones now peeling away from the coalition one by one, had been developed by Earth's Xenopolitical Department over 20 years of careful study. Humanity had, in effect, been fighting this war for 60 years before the first shot was fired. Varric Thal closed the document and sat in his chair for a very long time. On day 14, 3 days past the 11-day timeline the Dominion's original declaration had promised, he sent a private message to Earth's diplomatic channel. It was addressed to whoever was running Earth's strategic command. It requested direct talks. It was formal, as befitted a grand consul, but stripped of the ceremonial arrogance that had characterized the original declaration. It sounded, in its translated form, like a message from someone who had just read a very long report and needed a moment to sit with what it said. Megan Holt received the message first. Then she walked to Nathan Briggs's office. He had returned to Granite Watch by this point, and handed him the tablet. He read it. He looked at Laura Voss. Laura looked at Danny Ruiz, who was back from the forward operations, and sitting in the corner with a bottle of water and the slightly weathered look of someone who had not slept horizontally in a week. Danny read the message. "He wants to talk," Danny said. "He does," Megan confirmed. "Took him 14 days, Nathan said." "The declaration said 11, Nathan said. He's running behind schedule." There was a short silence. Then Danny smiled. "Just slightly. Where do we meet him?" The location they chose was a neutral station called Bridgepoint, a deep space facility that had belonged to one of the Dominion's smaller member species, a quiet people called the Leth, who had been among the first to request neutral status and had offered their station as a meeting ground with what seemed like genuine relief. Nathan Briggs, Laura Voss, Danny Ruiz, Megan Holt, and Greg Calloway traveled together on a diplomatic shuttle. They arrived in clean uniforms with no weapons visible. They brought a small support team and a lot of documentation. Varrichthal arrived with a larger delegation, 6 advisors and 2 security details. He was taller in person than his communications image suggested, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had spent a long time learning how to project authority, and was currently unsure whether that was still relevant. The 2 delegations met in a conference room the Leth had arranged with quiet efficiency. The table was round. The lighting was neutral. There was something warm to drink on a side table that nobody touched for the first 20 minutes. Varrichthal opened with a formal acknowledgement of defeat. It was structured, ceremonial, and clearly rehearsed. He had brought concession documentation. He had prepared posture points for negotiating terms. He had expected this to be a conversation about what humanity would take. Nathan Briggs thanked him politely. Then he slid a document across the table. Varrichthal looked at it. He turned through the first several pages in silence. He went back to the beginning and read from the top. His expression during this process went through several changes. Confusion first, then something close to suspicion, then a long stretch of careful blankness that Megan, who was watching him, recognized as the face of someone processing something that did not fit their existing model of the world. It was not a list of demands. It was not a conquest framework. It was a proposed cooperative structure, a joint council with seats for all 47 species, a mutual trade framework, shared infrastructure development, terms for the species that had already withdrawn from the Dominion to come in from the cold without reprisal from anyone. It was thorough. It was fair. It had clearly been written by people who had thought about it for a very long time. "You could simply take everything," Varrichthal said. It was not an accusation. It was more like a statement of arithmetic, a man trying to understand why the numbers were not adding up. "We could," he said. "We looked at that option. It seemed like a great deal of ongoing administrative work." Varrichthal was quiet for a moment. "You have been planning this framework for some time." "The diplomatic framework? About 20 years, Megan said from Nathan's left. "We always preferred this outcome. The military preparation was in case we could not get here directly." Varrichthal looked at the document again. Then he looked at Nathan and asked the question that his entire council had been unable to stop discussing since the first engagement report. "Why did your generals laugh?" Nathan folded his hands on the table. He took the question seriously, which Varrichthal noted. Your declaration included an intelligence assessment of our military capacity, Nathan said. It was 80 years out of date. The numbers were so far below what we actually have that every general in that room recognized immediately that you had no idea what you were walking into. We laughed because it was genuinely funny. But, he paused, we also laughed because we were relieved, he said. Not because we wanted the war to be easy, because we had been waiting for that declaration for a long time. And when it came, the thing we had been preparing for had finally arrived, and it was real, and it had made the oldest mistake possible. He looked across the table steadily. We had spent 40 years getting ready. When it was finally happening, there was a moment where it felt like the waiting was over. That felt good, and it also felt a little absurd. Both things at once. Varrichthal considered this for a long time. What is the oldest mistake? He asked. Looking at something you do not understand, Nathan said, and deciding it must be simple. The room was quiet. Eventually, Laura Voss reached over and poured 2 cups of whatever the warm drink was, and slid one across to Varrichthal. He looked at it for a moment, and then picked it up. She picked up her own. The negotiations took 4 more days. They were not easy. 47 species with different histories, different grievances, and different ideas about what a cooperative future should look like, produced complications that Megan's team had to work through with enormous patience. There were moments that stalled, moments that backtracked, moments where the whole thing seemed like it might fall apart over a specific wording in a specific clause. But it did not fall apart. The treaty was signed on a morning that was, by Earth reckoning, a Saturday. Nathan signed for the United Earth Defense Force and then passed the pen to Laura, who signed as well. Varrichthal signed for the Dominion. Representatives from 11 of the now neutral species signed as founding members of the Joint Council. Afterward, Varrichthal walked beside Danny Ruiz through the station corridor toward the departure bay. He had found himself somewhat against his expectation, able to talk to Danny more easily than the others. Danny was young and direct, and did not speak in the layered formal registers that diplomacy usually required. You laughed the hardest, Varrichthal said. He had been told this in passing by one of Earth's aides. I was the youngest one in the room when the declaration came in. I read the part where you gave us 11 days. He glanced sideways at Varrichthal. We had been building that defense grid for 30 years. 30 years, and your declaration said 11 days. He shook his head slowly. What else were we going to do? Varrichthal thought about that. At the departure bay, they shook hands, a human gesture that Varrichthal had looked up and practiced. Danny told him, without any irony at all, that he was glad it had worked out this way. Varrichthal believed him. On the long journey home, the Grand Consul pulled up the original declaration one last time. He had read it many times since the war began. But this time, he tried to read it through different eyes. Through the eyes of the people who had received it that Tuesday morning, who had read the outdated intelligence, and the 11-day timeline, and the ceremonial arrogance of a great empire, speaking to what it believed was a small and simple thing. He read it all the way to the end. He sat with it for a while. And somewhere in the quiet of deep space, far from any council chamber, or command bridge, or diplomatic table, Grand Consul Varrichthal of the Grand Dominion finally, reluctantly, let out a long, slow breath that was almost a laugh.